Well, thanks for showing up. It's quite a pleasure to be here. Yeah, so I've only been here in Florida, the state, for about a year and a half. So there's some things I'm still learning. Can you go back to that last little bit, just so I can explain it? So before I get going, it's just sort of an idea of why we do what we're doing, and the interest. And so this comes from NASA. It's from their satellite imagery that they've been collecting data for about 60 years. And they do a 5-year running average, and you can see the red and the oranges being increases in temperature compared to the previous 5 years, blue being cooler. And so this is much cooler in the 1920s, and starting to kind of warm up. You can see the polar regions are going to warm up usually a little bit quicker than the rest of the areas. But you can see it starts getting quite scary in the 80s and 90s here, and then this last decade, right? And so the really bright region that's changed the most are up in these polar regions, which is the things that we're worried about most. Okay. So I just want to give that as a sort of brief guide of why we're studying what we're studying. So a little bit on this talk and about me. So I actually did my undergrad as an environmental scientist major, not really knowing what I was going to do, but really interested in integrated sciences, trying to take not just physics and biology and chemistry that are usually sort of studied separately, but integrating them all together and having a better understanding of the world around us. And of course, in environmental sciences in the last 15 years, sort of really focused on sort of climate change, CO2, and so things that people will probably understand pretty well now. But things like the CO2 curve in the last 60 years rising. One of the things that sort of piqued my interest is everybody said, well, this is really different than what we've ever seen in the past. I said, well, that's really interesting, but how do we know this? And so I actually ended up doing all my higher education, both my master's and my Ph.D., studying climate change of the ancient world. So really getting into climate change and how this is different, how the normal climate change that's happened is different than what we see today. And so the picture here on the left is of the Mesozoic, right, dinosaurs around. It's actually a time period that I studied quite significantly at about 94 million years of really massive climate change event that had happened, but this was over almost 500,000 years, right? So very different than what we see today. It also, I'm not going to get into it, but it's also one of our major oil deposits. So it's really interesting that climate change of the ancient world, right, becomes the oil deposits that now we're sort of forcing and driving these climate changes today. And then things that we study is also in the earliest Earth history, as the picture on the right is depicting the Archean, or times when we had no oxygen in the atmosphere, and so we're trying to understand how these have changed. And so we use a lot of the tools that I'll talk about today to understand this. So the title being long, but Fingerprinting Earth's Climate Through History, how anthropogenic change is unprecedented, and other alternative ways, a geologic detective investigating climate change, right? So we're trying to use different tools to look at ancient climate change. So where we're going with this talk is I'll talk a bunch about carbon cycle, a few different things, hopefully give a couple of new perspectives on this. Then I'll talk about assembling the climate record and using proxies and how we do this in different ways to reassemble sort of ancient climate change and how we do this. The third, I'll go into ocean oxygenation, and I'll try to link these together and how this is important and how they're driven together. And this is actually what I studied mostly, is how oxygen has changed in both the marine environment and in the atmosphere, and why this is important. And then I'll give a couple of little conclusions and solutions at the very end. So one thing as scientists that you always are trying to push is that you have an idea of the hypothesis and what some outcomes of that hypothesis might be, right? When people first started understanding the atmosphere and understanding different elements within it, or compounds, I should say, they made some inferences on things that might be of interest in terms of controlling the Earth that we live in. And so in physics, in the late, about 150 years ago, they started noticing that CO2 if you put it in a vacuum, and you can actually have temperature increase just from straight CO2. This is just laws of physics. But they didn't really understand like climate change at that point or what it was going to be doing, but they did already start seeing that the physics based on CO2 has changes. And so things that you should be able to test, right? If you have increased CO2 or things like temperature rise based on this physics. Carbon isotopes, which I'll get into. This is some point that most people probably haven't heard of before. Sea level rise, obviously here in Florida, this is a pretty massive topic. Oxygen contents and how they relate to increased CO2 and also ocean acidification or acidity. I won't talk about ocean acidification at all today, but this is things that you might see in the news and people doing lots of research as we're seeing that the pH of our oceans are decreasing or becoming more acidic. It has major implications on organisms that calcify, right? Coral reefs is the main one that people think of, but even primary producers, which are these little tiny microscopic organisms in the oceans. All right, so a little chemistry, and you don't have to know these equations. I just want to use this as a jumping off point to sort of explain why this is important and how it works. Right, so our primary producers, these are microscopic algae in our oceans. On land, we see them as plants and trees, right? They take CO2 and water, and they make this is a hypothetical organic matter, organic carbon. It's a lot longer than that. The chains are much bigger. So I have it in quotes. And then they release oxygen, right? So we all sort of, most people probably understand this. So this is photosynthesis, right? The important part here is that you're taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, you're putting it into organic matter, but you're also increasing oxygen, right? So this is that tie to oxygen that I'll get back to at the end. Conversely, you and I, right, all things that respire take up organic matter, we consume oxygen, and we release CO2 and water when we breathe. So it's just the reverse of that same reaction. So this is respiration. Also, this is combustion, right? The same idea. One thing I should point out here is generally, you also need sunlight for the one on the top here for photosynthesis. We do this to get that energy back out. For cars, we get the energy, right? We drive the cars, so the combustion portion. So if these two things are happening in equilibrium, right, nothing changes. You have CO2 go into the system and water, something respires that, and then you're back at square one. So over the geologic history, we actually have not been in equilibrium. But we haven't been in equilibrium in the reverse way that we're not in equilibrium today. So that means that we, over time, we actually had lots of CO2 in our atmosphere in the early Earth's history. We had very little oxygen, probably actually none. Over time, what happened is you had photosynthesis happening. Some of that photosynthesis and organic matter settled out of the oceans, went to the sediments, and you have what we call organic carbon export into the sediments, that little bit of organic carbon being buried, right? So now you have a little bit of oxygen. If you go back to this equation, if you bury a little bit of this, I should say, you bury a little bit of this, you allow oxygen to stay in your system, right? So you actually increase oxygen over time. And so over time, we've increased our oxygen because we're burying a little bit of organic matter. It's really, really small amounts, but you have billions of years to work with. It starts increasing the oxygen in our atmosphere. And so what the ocean does is at the surface, we have photosynthesis that outpaces respiration. So you actually consume CO2 and your oxygen increases. In a deeper portion of the oceans where you don't have photosynthesis happening, you have respiration is outpacing photosynthesis. And so your CO2 goes up and your oxygen is actually decreased. We have a really wonderful thing. We have thermal healing circulation in our oceans, so it actually mixes it up. So it doesn't. You don't have no oxygen. We don't have an ocean with no oxygen in it. We actually have a pretty well oxygenated bottom waters, but you can have places that have a little bit of oxygen depletion. And so over time, this organic carbon, if it's in the right place and it has all the right geological components to it, can actually become your oil reservoir. You can do this on land as well, right? You can have plants and trees eventually decaying, and they can actually make coal and carbon as your carbon reservoir, and so this can increase as well there. All right, and so the oceans play a large role in sort of driving how much both CO2 are in our atmosphere and also oxygen. And I show these little guys. These are diatoms. They're silicious. They're microscopic organisms, so you need a pretty good microscope to see them. But these are the phytoplankton of our oceans. They're the plants, right? They're the ones taking that CO2 out and releasing oxygen. And they're the base of our food chain. So they're really, really important in terms of understanding how the ocean is working, and it also provides, after many orders of up the photic or the trophic level, you get to things like the dolphins, right? Which are, like you said, it's hard to give this talk while you're looking out and seeing dolphins wandering around. But, so this gives rise to understanding a little bit on the CO2 curve, or the Keeling curve, which is known as. And so this was the first one. It's off of Hawaii, so it was trying to get out in the middle of the Pacific with very little human activity around. And they started measuring in late 1957, the CO2 contents of our atmosphere. And so we've been doing this ever since. We've also added, I'll show you in a second, a whole bunch of different observatories. But we could see this rise, right, from about 318 when they first started to today, which we're about 406 ppm when I looked at last night. So we've risen a significant amount. One of the important points on this as well is that we're rising at about 2 ppm every single year right now. So it's pretty significant. It's actually the steepest climb we've had. It seems to keep increasing every single year. Now you see these keep saying this doesn't work. The variations, right? You see sort of a cyclic pattern. And so this is just because we're measuring this in the northern hemisphere. And so in the northern hemisphere, we have, and right about now, right, we switch from being more respiration happening, right, taking up all that organic matter and decaying it. Now we have plant growth. Maybe this doesn't hold so much as for Florida, but you can imagine places that have snowed all winter. You start having increase in primary productivity, so you have photosynthesis, which decreases that atmospheric CO2, which is why this is going down. Eventually, right, that's going to shut off in the fall. You have respiration, which then increases atmospheric CO2. So you have this sort of cyclic pattern, but over the long term, you see this increase. So one might say, well, that's just a local phenomenon. I've heard people that are climate deniers say, well, if you're at Mauna Loa, you're right on the edge of a volcano, just volcanic changes that are happening. Well, it's probably pretty hard to see this cyclic pattern, first of all. Secondly, they actually are measuring below where the CO2 goes out. They're about halfway down. But to combat that, they said, okay, let's actually look at a whole bunch of different stations. And there's actually more than this. This is, I think, the U.S. funded, mainly U.S. funded sites. And so you can see both the latitudinal range, so you can make sure that it's not just happening just because of where you're releasing it. It's at different ocean basins and places. But it's also, what you can't see on this is that it's different heights or altitudes within the atmosphere. So some things like the Lohe Pier, which is the observatory in San Diego, right at Scripps, which is where Keeling was a professor. That's right at the pier. You have other ones that are much higher, right? So you get a whole range, but you see this exact same pattern everywhere except one thing. If you're in the southern hemisphere, those peaks and troughs are going to be reversed, right? Because you're going to have photosynthesis and respiration happening on opposite ends of the year. But other than that, they're identical in the way they're shaping. So another aspect that I talked about CO2 in terms of and oxygen being tied together. So one thing that you should be able to see is if CO2 is going up because of combustion of fossil fuels, you should also see oxygen coming down, right? Does anybody know what the atmospheric concentration of oxygen is in our atmosphere?
Approximately 21%.
Yeah, 21%, right? So it's a lot compared to this really small amount of CO2, which is in parts per million. It's an order of 10,000 difference, basically. And so it's really hard to detect that, but we started measuring that not nearly as far back, it's only to 1990. But you can actually see oxygen concentrations. They do the same sort of cyclic pattern as CO2, which you have on the bottom. On the top is oxygen. But you can see that there's a small difference of oxygen being consumed through time as well. And so we're not at, there's no, I'm not just saying that we're going to run out of oxygen. We're a long ways away from that. But that there is a drawdown of oxygen, which shows that there's a tie into CO2 and combustion with this. So one of the main things that people argue about in terms of CO2 is, yes, there's natural variability of CO2, and we've known this for a very long time. And so here's a record of the last 400,000 years of CO2 where these periods where you have really high CO2 are interglacials, periods of low CO2 are glacial periods, so you have a lot more ice during those periods because you have cooler temperatures. And you see this natural cyclicity and your sort of peaks and valleys, and it's about 120,000 years that you go through this. You can extend this back with really good records to about 1 million years, because we have ice cores in certain places that go back that far. And so you see CO2 that's changed over this time. We can see it's a pretty narrow range, right? It's between about 280 and 160, or about 180 ppm. So a difference about 100 ppm. And so this is a relatively narrow range, but you have pretty big temperature swings and amounts of ice. And you can, if I go back a couple slides, you can see that we started here in 1960 at about 316 ppm, and we've already gone to about 406, so we've changed about 100 ppm just in the last 50-ish years. When we're talking about a change of 100 ppm here, we're talking about 100,000 years or more, right? So the difference in the change in the amount of time is very different. So on top of this, you can plot temperature variations, and so this is a range of temperatures between 4 and -8 degrees. 0 is just capped at what modern day values are. So it's a variation within that. So it's 4 degrees warmer or 8 degrees cooler, 10, but you can see it doesn't get all the way up to 4. So you can see a pretty big difference in temperatures. And this last little bit is the increase, right? We're headed off this graph by a long ways. Yeah.
How do we look at temperatures through ice cores, or how can you determine what the temperature was?
So temperatures, which I'll get to, is you can look at the shells that those little primary producers they make calcium carbonate, so CaCO3, which is what dissolves in acidic conditions. But you can actually look at oxygen isotopes on this, which I'll get into. I'll talk about isotopes. It's not that big a deal. You can take this signature of oxygen and its isotopic structure, and it can be deposited anywhere in the world. You can be in the equator, or you can be in the polar regions, either really close or really far to the glaciers. But you can tell something about how much oxygen is wrapped up in ice. So as you rain, if you pick up this ocean water, right, it's going to have whatever that isotopic signature is. But as you move farther and farther away from where it's raining, you actually get heavier and heavier. So your signature changes. So the rainfall that happens really quickly is one isotopic signature, and as it gets farther away, it becomes a different signature. And so that's actually recorded within ice because it locks it up. Does that make sense? So that's one way. You can also do this several other ways. There's things that you can work on with plants and stomatal indexes and a few other things. So I would say there's about 3 or 4 different processes that sort of go into a reconstruction like this. And it's not just one individual piece of evidence. As I'll sort of talk about, each one of them has their shortcomings, but they also add new information. So why do we care about temperatures, right? So this is my one slide on sea level change. And so during the interglacials, you can go back and look at how far sea level had intruded. And you can see the green here. Hopefully everybody recognizes this outline as Florida. But the green being land, blue being the ocean. And so this is the interglacial, right? So you have significant sea level rise. Glacial periods, you actually have a huge amount of ice wrapped up, amount of water wrapped up in ice, and so sea level drops, right? So you actually have all the way out to the shelf, our current shelf, which is about 100 miles from here to here. You have exposed as land, right? And there's, on the right there is just the modern representation. And so there's a big change, and this could represent tens of meters of sea level change, which is 30 or more feet, 30 to 100 feet of sea level change. Right? This is happening over, once again, 120,000, 150,000 years. It's a long time spans, but you have big differences, and largely tied to temperature and CO2. All right, so carbon isotopes, and I know everybody usually hears isotopes and they get freaked out. It's just a tool that we use, and so one way to think about this is they're all carbon, so they're all M&Ms, right? But there's slight differences within them, and it's basically their weight. And so you can think of them, they taste the same. They're different colors, but they taste exactly the same. And that's actually what you and I do, what plants do, is they are both carbon, but there's carbon-12 and carbon-13. Plants, anything for this matter, take up the lighter isotope because it's easier to break the bond. So they'll take up carbon-12 if there's carbon-12 around. And it's just preferential, they'll still take carbon-13. But there's a slight isotopic difference. And so you can see that in this little figure here. So the atmosphere isotopically is about -6, -7. The ocean's very similar in terms of its isotopic signature. Volcanic emissions are actually slightly heavier, more positive than the ocean or atmosphere, and this becomes really important because many times you hear people say, well, CO2 is just increasing because there's more volcanic activity. And it's hard to refute that unless you have this next slide that I'll show. Other things like if you weather the material on the continents is basically the same isotopic signature as the atmosphere and the oceans. The one thing that's really different is organic matter. So the decay of plants or algal material, so any sort of respiration of that gives a isotopic signature of about -25. The combustion of coal, which is the same thing, it's that plant matter, ancient plant matter is also right around -25. Combustion of oil has a range depending on the time period that it came from, but it's also quite negative, right? And so we can actually use this to reconstruct where all the organic carbon, or sorry, the CO2 that's in our atmosphere, where that might be coming from. And so if you take ice cores and you break them and you look at the little gas bubbles, you can get the CO2 concentration in them. We've been doing this for a significant amount of time. This record goes back to pre-industrial revolution, so 1840, right about 280, 282 parts per million. And that's the same curve you guys have seen. We don't have the resolution of the wiggles because you don't have this, you need a little bit more of the trapped bubbles than you can resolve with that. But we still see this increase closer to 400 ppm. What this paper, Rubino did, is they actually did the carbon isotopes of that same material. And what they see is values that start off right around -6.5, -7, which is right around where we think the oceans are. And you see a steady decline that almost mirrors the image of the concentration, but you see a really sharp decrease in the isotopic composition to about -8.5, right? And so there's two ways to get this. One way is people will throw out there is maybe this is because you're burning a lot of organic matter, right? So we know we burn rainforests, and we're currently still doing this. But when you take that into account for what we've done for the last century and a half, it's still not that big of an increase. You see that up here in green is the fossil use change, or sorry, yeah, the land use change. So this is essentially changing rainforests into places that you can then farm. And there's an increase and it's a change, but it's not a huge difference. But what we do know is that fossil fuel usage is exponentially rising. Yeah.
So what happened in the 50s where the curve took a nosedive, or?
Well, so you see that the fossil fuel increases about 1950, right? You have a huge difference in the amount of fossil fuel usage in that time period. More people start driving cars worldwide, right? And then you have a lot more industrial revolution globally about that time. So you get a lot more people. It's not just the U.S., right? The U.S. might have been kicking in before that, but other places globally are really starting to proliferate in terms of how much fossil fuels they're using. And so if you go back to this figure, is that if it was volcanic material, you'd actually expect this curve to increase in this direction. Not nearly as steep, but you would go a little bit upwards because you're inputting a whole bunch of more positive material. And so that would actually go the exact opposite direction. So the only way to do this is through the combustion of either coal or oil. And so this has to be with fossil fuels one way or another. And so this is I think the smoking gun of sort of fingerprinting that the CO2 rise is actually from changing in fossil fuel consumption. Unfortunately, this doesn't get played up very much in the media because I think most people sort of turn off when they hear isotopes. But it's a really powerful tool and way to sort of fingerprint where these are coming from. All right, so a little bit about sort of how do we know that the ancient climate is different or has responded differently than what we're seeing today. So assembling the climate record, and one way to think about this is that we have a puzzle, right? And we try to put as many pieces together to sort of understand what the ancient Earth was, sort of the conditions that it was in. But imagine that you've lost about 50% of those puzzle pieces because ocean floor is subducted, you don't have all the archives, you don't have seawater to look at, you don't have a lot of different things. And so we're trying to assemble that puzzle one piece at a time and try to make a sort of understanding of what it would have looked like. So one thing I get a lot when I talk about this is that people say, well, I don't really believe in proxies. And so one of the way to combat this is that we use these all the time, right? We put people in jail for crimes they might have committed without anybody ever seeing them, right? Nobody had direct evidence, but they left a piece of hair behind or blood, right? And they get DNA evidence. And so that's a proxy. Same thing. It actually uses the exact same machines in a lot of ways to getting DNA as we do to understand the climate. And so, forensics might use something that's more similar to this with DNA and fingerprints. As geologists, we look at things like maybe CO2, we might look at ice cores, but I'll give you a whole bunch of different other ways to understand what has happened in the ancient ocean. And so the reasons we have to do this is that the instrumental record, this is where we have really good reliable data, right? This is the very first movie I was showing from NASA, right? We have awesome satellite imagery, but that only goes back a very short distance in human history. And so you might be able to get back 100 years. If you look at the historical record, this might be things that people write down, which can sometimes be inaccurate. So you can look at the accuracy as maybe somewhat decreasing through this as well, but it's a way to reconstruct this. So then you can look at tree rings. Most people know about tree rings, and sort of reading the thickness of a tree ring versus how thin it is might tell you how much water was around. Right? But the oldest trees only go back about 10,000 years, so you can't go back very far. Still useful, right? All these things together become really useful because you can sort of validate different ideas with them. Ice cores go back about 1 million years, about 800 or 900,000 years, and are quite useful to look at. You can look at CO2 concentrations, you can look at dust, you can look at a whole bunch of different other proxies within ice to understand sort of these glacial-interglacial relationships.
Is that the size of a typical ice core?
Yeah, they're quite large,
Oh,
the boreholes. So when you do a tree ring, they usually are really small because they don't want to kill the tree. So they take a really small portion. With ice cores, it's a little bit bigger in order to get, because if you imagine if you're looking at a specific time, you'd have to slice this whole core open along that. And so in order to get a measurement, you need a fair amount of material to then actually look at it for a given slice of time. They vary too. So it depends on what sort of machines and equipment you have out in the field and how remote it might be. So. Other things you might look at are coral reefs. And this is a much smaller core, but you're sort of going in through rock. And you can look at where corals are, which tell you something about the environment that they were deposited in, how saline it was, what the temperature was, how close it was to the surface, all sorts of things you can reconstruct from coral reefs. And these go back, really good pristine samples go back a few million years. There's other time periods where you might get some coral reefs as well, but not quite as pristine. But to get much farther back than that, we use ocean sediments, right? So this is sediments that are deposited that lithify and become rocks. And we can look at various different components of that to understand different climate events. And so this is a picture of the diatoms again on the right. But those are picked out from the ocean sediments. And so you can look at different portions of that sediment to understand what ocean climate's doing. So for the Cenozoic, the last 60 million years, so since the extinction of the dinosaurs, we have really good records using little phytoplankton like this. It could be diatoms or calcareous material that have this record, but we can reconstruct it really, really well. Farther back than that, we have a little bit more difficulty. This core here, the sediment core, is the extinction of the dinosaurs. So that little brown layer in the middle, right by the historical, is the iridium spike that is known as sort of the meteor impact. And so this is a really nice sort of evidence of this. You can look in sediments, but we can do this for various different cores as well. So on top of that is mapping these proxies. And so you can see coral reefs are sort of defined in the equatorial region. So it tells you something about one specific place in the ocean, which is useful, but it doesn't tell you the whole ocean, right? You can look at tree rings. They're actually more in the northern hemisphere, but more importantly in the mid-latitudes. And that's because you have differences in rain, right? So you have seasonal variation, where if you're in the equator, you don't have seasonal variation. You don't get very good tree rings in the equator. So they're sort of in the middle latitudes. You can look at ice cores, right? Gives you the polar regions, the very ends, and maybe some high altitude things. But relatively, you don't get the whole record, right? And so individually, they're only telling you something, but together they're telling you about the whole globe. But if you add ocean sediments, we could take this from anywhere in the world, and this is looking at about 3 different sample repositories of the world, and there's more than this, of all the places in the ocean that we've sampled, right? So you can look at lots of places in sediments. And they have their limitations too, because we can only look at so much time per sediment. So, but all together, these compile into one whole picture to better understand how climate change has happened over this time. So one of the major events that we look at, and this is a Cenozoic, so this is the last 65 million years, so since the dinosaurs. One of the major things we look at is called the PETM up in the red. So it's just the boundary event. It's called the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. And you can see a really quick spike. It goes up and down. And that's, if you look at the left here, is the equivalence in temperature variation. And that's the largest climate perturbation and the fastest climate perturbation we've seen in the geologic record. So it's been a lot of work sort of focused on this to understand how and why this happened and what sort of catastrophic sort of events it might have had, or cascade of events that could have led to. And we see large temperature changes. We see, especially phytoplankton, so those primary producers in the ocean, they struggle due to ocean acidity, temperature, nutrients as well. And they decrease, and there's sort of it's not an extinction per se, but there's a turnover, so more things are not doing very well. And so the PETM is the largest event that we have to look at, and that's what we normally compare sort of the modern record to. So if we look at the modern record in terms of a temperature change that's forecasted for the current and what we know for this event, the PETM. So the PETM has rather large temperature swings. It's about 10 degrees Fahrenheit, the change. And this is based on 2 billion metric tons of carbon per year. But you can see the time scale, right? This is over almost 15,000 years. And so we have a pretty long time scale to sort of change. Where what we're currently doing is about 30 billion metric tons of carbon per year. And we see a temperature change that's actually going to be probably larger than that and happen over almost 300 years. So this is really, really rapid. And the problem with that is that things can evolve. They do evolve, things as in organisms, animals, plants. But if you don't give them enough time, right, they can't sort of make these latitudinal changes. For instance, we know in the Mesozoic, when there's dinosaurs around, we have lily pads, we have alligators in the Arctic Circle, right? It was really warm, it had lots of CO2, but it was a really different world. There's no glaciers pretty much worldwide. It was really warm. It was probably the temperatures of Florida, near Florida in the polar regions. And so these are very different times, and also these perturbations that we're talking about took sometimes millions of years, right? So things can, those palm trees could change and they could migrate, or any other organism for that matter, right? So time is probably the biggest thing that we're really talking about when we talk about climate change, and also us, right? We've never lived on a world that didn't have glaciers in the polar regions. All right, so I have about 10 minutes. That should be about right for this last little bit. So one aspect of understanding climate change that nobody really talks about very much is also with oxygen and the change of oxygen. I showed you atmospheric oxygen changing. But one thing we've also started recognizing is that oxygen in our oceans are changing. And this obviously is really important for if you are interested in saving turtles or dolphins or any of these sorts of things. They need oxygen. And so in the ocean, we naturally have places that have oxygen deficiencies. They're called oxygen at minimum zones. And so this is off the coast of Peru. You see the purple being really low dissolved oxygen at about 200 meters water depth. And then below this, it would actually have increased oxygen, and above that would also have more oxygen. And this is primarily driven because it's really highly productive regions. It has lots of organic matter that's being produced that sinks down, and there's lots of organisms that are consuming that, driving oxygen low. And this naturally happens. This is a productive region because of the way ocean circulation works. This upwelling of nutrients coming up. And so this is natural, but if you have an increase in temperatures, you actually have lower amounts of oxygen that can be dissolved in that gas. Lower amounts of oxygen, that gas being dissolved in the water. And so you can drive a bigger oxygen depletion in these regions, and even other places worldwide. And so this is what it might look like if you looked at a cross-section vertically, is that you have oxygen concentrations high at the surface, low sort of below the photic zone where you have all this primary production happening, and then an increase because you have, in the deeper ocean, because you have ocean circulation bringing oxygen back into the system. So this naturally happens, but what we have noticed, like I said, is that we've had a decrease in oxygen in various places worldwide. We know mainly of places that have heavy science funding, so places like North America and in Europe, but a lot of these other places we're seeing oxygen depletion as well. So in the US, the Cape Cod estuaries, Chesapeake Bay, which is probably the most well-studied one, Long Island Sound, I should have added on this, the Gulf of Mexico is another one that we know of. And so these have profound implications on the nutrient cycling, on the trace metals that are there, and then obviously on the biology as well. As you can see over the last 100 years, you can see that the sites that we've seen in hypoxic regions or low oxygen are increasing dramatically. So there's two reasons for it. Well, there's two things that you can think about. One is we're looking for it more often, right? So it's also an increase. And also our technology is getting better. But if you take just the last 50 years where we have all these things, you still see a pretty rapid increase in this deoxygenation. And currently we're working on understanding how quickly this happens over glacial-interglacial cycles. And we're seeing a decrease in oxygen right now in our global oceans that's as big as some of the big extinction events that we see in terms of how rapid this is happening. And so this is something that can, long term can have a major effect, probably long after humans are around, but has a big effect on our fisheries and how the ocean chemistry is playing a role in all this. So a couple take-home messages, if you just want a quick bullet point in this, but carbon isotopes, right, show this excess CO2 is some sort of combustion, either oil or coal. This modern rate of change that we're seeing is much faster than anything we've ever seen before. We're changing at a rate of about 2% a year right now in our CO2, about 1% a year in our CO2 concentrations, and in the glacial-interglacial cycles, you're talking about an order of magnitude lower than that, about 0.1% per year. So this is a pretty significant increase in terms of the rate of change that we're currently seeing. As you would predict based on CO2, as our modern low oxygen conditions are expanding worldwide. And so this is largely due to ocean warming from heat trapping blankets, so the CO2 that goes in the atmosphere decreases the solubility of all gases in the ocean, so it increases the impact of how much oxygen can be there, but also an increased nutrient runoff, which I'll talk about here in a second. So all the nutrients we put on our farms and our lawns, any of that excess stuff that comes off and gets run off into the oceans increases that phytoplankton growth, which then drives deoxygenation of the oceans, right? So this is a pretty big impact. I should say it's not just nutrient runoff in terms of that. Also, one major impact is the nitrogen that comes out of sewer systems or individual home yeah, thank you, septic tanks. So septic tanks have a pretty big driver on how much nitrogen comes off, which is one of those nutrients that's really important. And so lastly, the geologic record shows climate change affects this ocean oxygenation and leads to changes in ocean chemistry and biology. So we know that from the geologic record, and we're just now starting to see some of these things in terms of change in oxygen in the ocean and what sort of effects it might have. And it doesn't take very much. That's one of the major things that we've come across in the last 5 years in the research, is that it doesn't take a lot of the ocean to become deoxygenated to have profound implications on the biology and on the nutrients that get delivered. And this is largely because these deoxygenated oceans can take up a lot of bioessential nutrients, right? Just like you and I, we need things that are in minute amounts, like copper, zinc, or these things. Phytoplankton need those too, but those will go into sediments if they're deoxygenated. And so they'll strip out the oceans of those important nutrients, and then the rest of the ocean has a hard time having lots of phytoplankton, which then the cascading of events sort of leads to turnover and extinction at that point. So some solutions, right, for this change in deoxygenation, right, is really this decrease in nutrient input, which there's been a more concerted effort on this front, I think, in the last 10-ish years. But certainly we could do a better job at this, and it sort of comes down. We saw it with last year, right, with nutrients from Lake Okeechobee, right, where there's a huge nutrient sort of runoff into the oceans, led to red tides and things like this. So any sort of excess fertilizers, decreased untreated wastewater input, which is septics, but also our municipalities that do this. And then largely, I think a major one that is probably a little bit more attainable for like individual people is protecting estuaries and marshlands, wetlands. These are really important because these strip out nutrients, also actually toxic metals. It'll actually take those up and not deliver them to the ocean. And it's a really effective sink for CO2, and probably one of the most effective sinks of CO2 in the world. And so as we're still populating, and these are always in areas that people want to live. Everyone wants to live near the ocean, right? But these are the lands that are probably most affected by human population and have a large effect on the carbon cycle. So the more we can protect these, the better off we are. And so any sort of land that we set aside in these regions are certainly a bonus and will help mitigate, at least at some level, some of the fossil fuel burning that we're doing. So thank you. I want to thank my funding agencies, which are NASA, mainly NASA and NSF, but some money from Florida State, and then some other couple of institutions where I've had money. But one of the there's been lots of different cartoons that are thrown out there, but this one always sort of makes you feel better no matter what side of the fence you've been on, right? Is that what if this is a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? I mean, could it be better than having all these different things, right? So, you guys, I'm open to having questions. We're ready for that?
Sure.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
You bicycled here, so you decrease your CO2.
Could you speak to the increased release of methane gas and how that compares to CO2?
All right, so methane is really important. It's actually a much more potent greenhouse gas. So it takes less methane in the atmosphere to have a big increase in temperature. And so these are things that are coming out from permafrost, right? So as you melt sort of frozen soil in the Arctic, you release methane. And you can have them from other places. We have natural methane seeps in the Gulf of Mexico, which are they just sort of double up methane. But these are really strong pollutants or greenhouse gases. So one of the aspects is that PETM, the really large perturbation. We actually think that's probably largely caused by methane. So in the deep ocean, we have these things called methane clathrates. They're like frozen methane, basically. If you bring them up to the atmosphere with pure oxygen, they spontaneously will combust and light fire. But as those release, if you have a warmer ocean, let me back up. Methane clathrates in the deep ocean, it's cold, it's got lots of pressure, right? And that's what keeps them stable. As you increase temperature, it actually decreases their stability, and then they can release methane. And so then that methane's released, it's really potent, and so then it has a larger impact on the heating of the atmosphere. It eventually turns to CO2. So with oxygen and methane, that will turn into CO2 just based on oxidation reactions. So long term, it still becomes CO2, but on a short term, it's methane, and it's really potent. And so there's a large amount of research right now going into understanding methane in wetlands and how this might be changing as it's warming, and also these permafrost layers. And the PETM is not the only geologic event that we know that methane is probably important for. My postdoc just had a paper published that's deeper in time in the Jurassic, so that also suggests that there's some methane that causes a climate event in that period
You're
as
not
well.
currently producing it?
Are we currently well, we producing it in a sense like
Drilling, fracking?
so yeah, part of, well, if you ever look at an image of light map right now, and you look in the middle of South Dakota, in North Dakota region, it is lit up. Well, it's lit because they have to burn off that methane when they're drilling. So it's really hard to capture. And so instead of having methane being released and being really potent greenhouse gas, they just burn it and make CO2 out of it. Ideally, you would trap it, and we could use this for natural gas heating and things like that. But they just burn it as a release product, and you can actually see this. So yes, as part of fracking, any sort of hydrocarbon things related activity, there's certainly methane that comes off. And because it's a really small molecule, it's just CH4. It's super light. It's hard to capture it. That's why they burn it a lot of times. If you have it during like oil production when they're refining it, it's much easier to trap because it's in a more contained area, so they can capture that. Yeah.
The ocean temperatures are rising and the corals are bleaching. How does that affect marine life and the whole marine ecosystem?
Well,
In 1 minute or less.
did you see the study that came out was just this week, right, on Australia, right, the Great Barrier Reef, in terms of its bleaching, and it's happening much quicker than anybody thought. Corals, right, they provide sort of it's a symbiotic relationship with all the organisms living around it. So it provides a home, it provides shelter, and so the entire impact on the ecosystem is large. I think all of the interactions between those things are still not incredibly well understood in terms of how this will happen. We certainly can't look at the geologic records and figure that out because we don't have a good enough record in terms of being able to look at the biology relationships with the coral reefs in terms of change. But from the short sort of period of time we have been looking at, as you bleach these coral reefs, those organisms that use that as a host either have to migrate, but that's going to put them all into one region, so obviously that's not going to really work. So there's the exact give and take on that is, I think, not well understood, but be pretty impactful. So, and there's certainly other people that are probably much more well equipped to answer that question than me, but as I'm not a biologist at all. Yeah. Oh, let's go here. Yeah.
Under the isotopes there, it
Yeah.
looks like the burning of coal was a lot less harmful than the burning of oil. Coal was a little dot, and oil was big.
Well, that's just the isotopic range of it. So coal has a really narrow range because it comes from plants, and the time period that coal comes from is like sort of one geologic periods, so it's not a big range. Where oil has, the oil that we produce ranges for about 700 million years, and it has various different isotopic signatures depending on where you're at and where you get it from. And so the isotopic signature has a big range, but in terms of the amount of mass, we can't tell if it comes from coal or oil. You can go back and reconstruct how much coal and oil we produced and sort of back calculate that. I didn't say that. From what we know that we produced, which is not great figures, you'd think we'd actually have a good number of that, but oil companies don't really release these things. Is that you can back calculate it and you can actually do the mass balance and you get pretty close to the same values. So it's unknown exactly how much from each of those, but the coal is just a smaller dump because of less uncertainties than the oil. That range I should have said was an uncertainty of where you're getting it from and the greatest changes that you can have. Yeah.
Yeah, you indicated that the polar regions are showing a much greater warming than other parts of the world. Why would that be?
So the atmosphere circulates. It wants to move hot air to colder regions. It wants, ideally, what both the ocean and the atmosphere would want is the entire ocean and atmosphere to be the exact same temperature, no matter where you were at. So it moves hot air from the equator to the polar regions. That's why, if you look at that map right behind you, and you look at where England is, right, point England for me, right? If you trace that across to Alaska, right, and England barely gets any snow. The reason why is that all that warm water and air mass from, I'm going to say it's from Florida, but it's from that region is moving in that direction and keeping England warmer. And so it's moving warm air to cold regions. Alaska doesn't have that because of the way that the atmosphere, or the rotational velocity of Earth. But so it's moving all that warm air, and so we're getting excess warm air in the equator, and it's moving more of that to the cold regions. And so generally the equator probably isn't going to change very much in temperature. It's about as warm as it's going to be until everything becomes the same temperature. Good question. Yeah.
In your title, there was the term anthropogenic.
Oh shoot.
What is that?
I should have said that. So anthropogenic refers to human activity. So it's if you look at if you look at the geologic record, we have names for everything, right? And the Mesozoic, the time of the dinosaurs, right? So anthropogenic just being the time of humans. And likely this is going to be a relatively short window compared to, we always think of the dinosaurs some people think of them being around a really long time. In terms of geologic history, it's not that long. But in terms of human history, they're around for 250 million years. So it's a pretty significant amount of time where humans have been around or human-like organisms have been around for about a couple of million years, right? And so anthropogenic being sort of the human, especially the last 1,000 years where we had major changes on our ecosystem, right? And so we focus on CO2 in terms of the changes, but there's large impacts that we've done well before industrial revolution, right? With whaling and all sorts of different things on that front, and how many changes that we might have had. Yeah.
Do you, or maybe not you, but your colleagues or even some of your students, given that this issue has become so politicized, have you found any nuggets of wisdom, and Kenneth, this may be for you as well, of how to talk about this so that you're not alienating part of your audience, and also so that the solutions seem more manageable for your average Joe Blow visitor to Marineland? Which is not you guys, by the way.
There's so many aspects to that. Every group is self-selecting, right? This group is self-selecting. You guys came to something that was titled climate change. People that come to Marineland are also going to, Marineland are also going to be a little bit self-selected. So that also makes it difficult. But I was just telling these guys before. I'm in the middle of doing a bathroom renovation. I had no idea why I did that. But I had a contractor come by and found out what I did. And he said, "Oh, I don't believe in climate change. I don't think this is." He said, he was very open-minded. He said, "I don't really know enough, but I don't really think humans are causing this." And I first said, "There's nothing to believe. This isn't a belief, right? There's lots of data that are sort of suggesting this. And so if you just let the data sort of drive it." that's the first thing that I sort of try to help with, which, you know, if you have somebody that's really on one camp, it's difficult. But after I sort of did a mini version of this, he sort of said, okay, well, that does somewhat make sense. But he was open-minded, right? And so I think if you have people that are really, really closed-minded, I've given this talk at the New England Aquarium, and they use the carbon isotopes. I know they've used it to a number of different people as a better way of sort of showing sort of the source input, and that has helped. But you know, really framing this in terms of, you know, you try to, for the political part of it, I try to stay away from saying climate change. You know, it used to be global warming, and the scientists actually are the ones that sort of changed that terminology, because we started realizing, especially if you look at this figure, that some places are going to become warmer, some places are going to become cooler or not change very much, some places are going to become wetter, some places are drier. And so that's why the term changed from global warming to climate change, and now climate change has sort of been hijacked of this partisan sort of issue, right? I was, about a year and a half ago, I was on Capitol Hill, and I was talking to Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island, who's probably the biggest advocate for climate change, and has the most knowledge, I would say, in the Senate. And he was sort of dumbfounded by the same thing. Like, how do we get this across to people who the data is just there, and it seems like it shouldn't be this difficult, but for some reason, because it's apparently going to affect businesses and money, you know, it all sort of ties in together. So, right now, how do we deal with EPA, right, or NOAA for that instance? So, I don't know where it's headed for the next few years. So, let's see.
And I would just tack on, there's a great resource that's climateinterpreter.org that provides a lot of resources in helping communicate this topic specifically. One thing that we try to press upon our audiences is that this is, I mean, you showed a great example that this is human. This is from combusting, driving vehicles, burning fuel. So this is a civic issue. This is all of us together have contributed to this issue. So the way that we're going to solve this is by us all working together to solve this. As it's not what I can do, it's what we can do together to help fix this, which it is fixable. It's not going to hell in a handbasket, so we're good.
We've done it before, right? We did it with CFCs and the ozone. So, and that's come around quite a lot, and it's done really well with legislation and treaties and accords. And so, yeah, hopefully, I mean, if we stop burning and we go to sort of greener fuels, certainly can come on the other side and not have as big of an impact, right? Even if we stopped right now, it's still going to rise because it takes a while to sort of get through the system. But at that point, it is something that we can manage. Yeah.
Do you think that people's lack of acceptance is based on fear tactics and perceiving? When you're afraid of something, you just don't want to hear about it. And if it was a more positive, we are doing this, we can do this, you open up and listen?
Yeah, I mean, having solutions is always a much better sort of avenue, right? Instead of saying you have to change something, if we have a sort of a community-wide solution, it becomes a lot easier to deal with. And so, ideally, that would happen. Some of it's educational for everybody, media included, across the board. But yeah, how we get to that point is questionable. So, and unfortunately, money always plays a role in this. So it's akin to how long it took to get, or how much power tobacco companies had, and the misinformation that gets put out there. You can actually look at oil companies are smart. I have friends there, so I try not to say too many bad things, but at the same time, they're actually the biggest investors in solar power, but they also are big investors in terms of these other subsidiaries that then go out and lobby, right, and do things that are on their behalf. So how we get that out of the system and everybody, it's usually an education for the whole society.
So how would people, if they have additional questions, be able to contact you for more information? Or
so my email's up here, although it might not be that big, and my handwriting's not great. But it's JD Owens at fsu.edu, and if you look up FSU's website, the department is Earth, Ocean, Atmospheric Sciences. You can find my name. That as well. You can remember. Yeah.
Doesn't nature itself, however, have the ultimate solution?
It absolutely does.
If we raise the water, the ocean,
Yeah.
it's going to encroach on the land.
Mhm.
That will encroach on people. That will encroach on food supply. And if we reduce people and we reduce food supply, we solve the problem.
So at NNOCCI, at this climate interpreter, I was a science fellow with a whole bunch of people that are in places that are interpreting science, aquariums and zoos and things. And quietly, I brought that exact point up. Is that nobody wants. I have 2 young kids, right? So I'm in this boat as well. But the biggest issue, right? We could have 1,000 people on this planet driving as many cars and burning as many fossil fuels as you want. You're not going to do very much. But when you have the amount of people we have, certainly that's the biggest issue, right? And yes, in some way of reducing that population, which could certainly be food supply. Although our biggest food supply, right, is the San Joaquin Valley of California, which is probably pretty buffered by the ocean and the breadbasket. But certainly that's a big issue in terms of people and relocation. And so, yeah, I think that's certainly the biggest solution is reducing people. I don't know how you do that. I'm out of the door.
So essentially, the spike is equal portion to the spike in population.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, I have a really good figure when I teach class, is that population rise was pretty steady for all of human history. Actually, here's a scary stat. Of all of human history until 1950, if you added up all the humans that existed, it's less than the amount of population we have on the planet right now, right? And so that increase is certainly very dramatic. Yeah, there's more people alive than have ever lived on this planet, which is a pretty disturbing fact. And that's certainly is directly related to that same spike. You have a question as well?
The greatest trigger seems to be the burning of fossil fuels. That seems to be the greatest trigger and the greatest data that you can tie to the spike in heat.
Well, that's one thing that changed, right? In the 1850s, is that you moved from factories that were, blowing glass based on wood, right, or any other thing that used energy, to then a big switch into coal and other fossil fuels. And that change was relatively slow until about 1950, and then there was a huge, big impact at that point.
So rather than wiping out everybody, you just shut off the oil consumption, burn it, the fossil fuels burn it.
Yeah.
We all ride our bikes like Fred. We all don't ride.
Well, yeah, we ride our bikes.
Your bathroom probably doesn't have flush water. You do have flush water?
I have that computer too that's tied with me. That also does it, right? So, but it's a community sort of solving of this and going to alternative fuels and sort of things, having smart houses.
It's also just international. China's a coal plant every year.
Right. Yeah, China and India are our largest populations, and they're certainly becoming more industrialized. They're still a ways away from their history of burning as much fossil fuels as Americans. I shouldn't say just Americans, but the Western world. But yeah, so everybody has to sort of jump on, right? So it's how that works, and that's where the politics becomes really difficult. If everybody's at the table, we're much better off, getting that taken care of. So.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jeremy. Thank you. All right, guys, and if you have any questions, just